Good afternoon. I'm Deborah Martin Owens. I'm Chair of Women Creating Change. Thank you so much for being with us this afternoon. This program is called Local Elections, How and Why to Vote. Before we get started, we have some housekeeping. This event is being recorded. Perhaps we'll use the link for social media and other platforms, so please understand that. Also, thank you to Disability Rights for our closed captioning. They've graciously provided this opportunity for us to provide this service. Thank you to Annette Blau. Today, you can access closed captioning services by clicking the CC icon at the bottom of your screen. And if you don't see it there, find the three dots at the bottom of your Zoom window labeled More and select Subtitles. Disability Rights New York is the protection and advocacy organization for New York. It works to protect and further the rights of New Yorkers with disabilities by enabling them to determine their own lives and fully participate in their community. DRNY is committed to making its programs and the programs we partner with as accessible as possible. We put DRNY contact information in the chat now and at the end of the program. This is an engaging event, so please use the Q&A for your questions and your comments. We want to hear from you. We want you to be engaged. Send us your questions and answers. A little bit about Women's City Club of New York. As I mentioned, I'm the chair of the board, and Carol Wasey is the president and CEO of the organization. We were founded in 1915, a little while ago, but we are still thriving and exciting. WCC is committed to expanding women's civic participation and to bring about more just and equitable city, a city that I've loved and have been a native New Yorker of. WCC focuses on partnering with organizations to provide civic engagement programs for women, and we work on policy to ensure policy changes takes place, address systemic barriers to civic engagement. Why are we here today? Well, local elections are very important. We just went through a national election and we were incredibly engaged. That's exciting, but all politics is local. And so this year, we'll be electing a new mayor, a comptroller, borough presidents, and city council members. There's a lot here. New Yorkers have the option to rank their top 5 for special elections and primaries. First and foremost, as I said, we are here to be engaged. So please get in the chat, get in the Q&A. We want to hear from you. And finally, thanks to our partners and the moderator, we have Democracy New York and NYC Civic Engagement. Thank you to those partners for us today. Our moderator, Melva Miller, Association for a Better New York. Thank you so much, Melva, for being here. Roshni Ahmed for Women of Afghan Women. Thank you. Lurie Daniel Favors at Medgar College. Thank you, Lurie, for being here. And Commissioner Bitta Mostofi, Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs. Thank you so much. And now I get the opportunity to introduce Laura Wood. Laura Wood, first of all, Derek Davis says hello. So he said, I need you to say hello to Laura. So Laura, hello from Derek Davis. Laura is the Senior Advisor and General Counsel to the Mayor's Democracy New York Initiative, advising on election law and voting reforms. Democracy New York's mission is to increase voter registration and participation in New York City. Prior to this position, she spent 5 years as Senior Advisor and Special Counsel to New York Attorney General. Before that, she was the Chief Counsel to the Democratic Conference of New York State and Policy Director to Senator Daniel Squadron. Laura is a graduate from Northwestern and Brown University. Thank you so much, Laura, for all that you've done today. We're so excited to have you. And again, please be engaged. It's so great to see everyone today.
Thank you so much, Deborah, and thank you to everyone who has joined us this afternoon for this wonderful panel. As Deborah said, I'm Laura Wood with the DemocracyNYC initiative. We are a nonpartisan mayoral initiative focused on increasing voter participation and civic engagement. And as Deborah said, there are very important local elections coming in just 2 months. And so we are very focused right now on a voter engagement campaign to educate New Yorkers on ranked choice voting and encourage New Yorkers to participate in local elections. And then, you know, we also work on policy issues and push for election reforms to make voting easier. And we have so many great partners in that effort, many of whom are joining us today. And we are especially grateful to Women Creating Change for their partnership in putting this panel together. So thank you so much to everyone. Before I turn it over to our wonderful moderator and panel, I'm just going to give a very quick overview of ranked choice voting. As you know, New York City is now using it in primary and special elections for New York City offices. And ranked choice voting is actually pretty simple to explain. Basically, what it allows is for you to rank up to 5 candidates in your order of preference. And we're going to actually do a little demo of what that looks like in a moment. But the key is that a lot of people still don't know it's happening and don't know that they will have that opportunity to make their voice heard that much more when they go to the ballot box. And so that's why we are investing so much of our time and energy into making sure that New Yorkers know that they can choose up to 5 candidates. They can still rank only 1 candidate or fewer than 5. But our view is that it's in voters' interests to consider ranking 5 because it actually gives them more of a say in who ultimately gets elected. Even if their first choice candidate doesn't win, they still have 4 other choices who may be in the running. And later in the event, we will share, along with Women Creating Change and our other wonderful partner, the Civic Engagement Commission, a toolkit which highlights some helpful resources to help spread the word. But what we wanted to do very briefly is actually share with you a sample ranked choice voting ballot to give everyone a sense of what we're actually talking about, what voters are going to see in June when they go to the ballot box or when they request their absentee ballot. And we're trying to make it fun. So what we've done is we've created a ballot featuring different parks throughout the city that are named after historic women leaders. So I think my colleague is going to share that ballot on the screen. There we go. What you will all have the opportunity to do is actually cast your votes in this mock election. I believe there is a link being posted for folks who are interested, who can actually rank your top 5 parks named after women and historical figures. And what you can see is that the results show that there is, there is a clear top vote getter after the first round. And what happens is that the park walled playgrounds with 1 vote, and well, there we go. So the lowest vote getters get eliminated and their votes get distributed so that as we go through these rounds, and here we go, we're down to 3. And then ultimately at the end, we are down to 2, with Shirley Chisholm's Circle being the winner and having the majority of the votes after all of the other parks have been eliminated. And our panelists will go into more detail about this, but we encourage everyone to see, check out the link to the sample ballot, vote your preferences, and then you can actually spend as much time as you want or as little time as you want actually playing around with this tool. There's some really great explainers on this website as well about how this all works and how the votes get calculated. So I hope folks have fun with that. And this is a tool, by the way, that is available in 15 additional languages. And so we are really hoping that our partners will help use it and help spread the word throughout the city to lots and lots of New Yorkers. So thank you for indulging us in that exercise. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce our moderator and our panelists. We are so thrilled that Melva Miller, the Chief Executive Officer of ABNY, has agreed to serve as our moderator today. Thank you, Melva. And as you know, our distinguished panelists are Roshni Ahmed, who is the Coalition and Outreach Coordinator at Women for Afghan Women. And then we have Lurie Daniel Favors, who is the Interim Executive Director of the Center for Law and Social Justice at Medgar College. And we are also thrilled that our Commissioner of the Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs, Bitta Mostofi, is joining us. And Moya and Bitta's entire team have been such key partners in this effort to help educate New Yorkers and develop multilingual materials and resources. So we're really thrilled with everyone joining us today. And with that, I will turn it over to Melva. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Laura, for that introduction and inviting me to moderate today. Before we start, I want to give a shout out to Senator Leroy Comrie, who has joined us. He's actually my senator. I live in his district. So it's always a pleasure to see him participating in discussions like this. So thank you for joining us, Senator. And good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this very, very important discussion on local elections, really focusing on how and why to vote. Right. First, I'd like to thank DemocracyNYC, Women Creating Change, and the New York City Civic Engagement Commission for inviting me to moderate today's panel. And as Laura mentioned, we have some phenomenal speakers today. So get your pens, get your pads. You're going to get some information today, and we want you to share what you learned on today's discussion. So let's jump right in. And to all those watching this afternoon, throughout the discussion, please post questions in the Zoom chat function or on Facebook. We will try to get to as many questions as possible. So I'm going to start with a few questions of my own. So to set the stage a bit, there has been a lot said in recent months about how the 2021 election in New York City will have the largest impact in reshaping the city's political and social landscape in recent election histories, right? We're talking about an estimated 500 candidates running for mayor. I mean, we have probably over 400 who have already declared for mayor, comptroller, public advocate, 2 district attorneys, 5 borough presidents, and 2/3 of the city council seats. Within this, we know that New York City has historically had low turnout in all elections, despite high levels of voter registration by New York City residents, right? And in local elections, voter turnout is even lower. According to the New York City Campaign Finance Board in 2017, only 26% of registered voters participated in the mayoral general election. In predominantly Black, Indigenous, and communities of color, BIPOC communities, voter turnout was as low as 8.2%. So we must do better. We need to figure out how to engage New Yorkers in this process of voting for people who will represent them in their communities. So this question is for all of the panelists. Can each of you talk about the importance of the June primary in the context of other elections, both on the local level and the federal level, and tell us a little bit about the work you and your organizations are doing to address this. And to start, I'd like to ask Commissioner Mostofi if you can start first.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for including me in this really, really critical conversation. I think just the sheer number of races that are happening and hearing the number of candidates in those races, it's both exciting and it can be daunting. And hopefully through this conversation, we'll be able to emphasize why this is so important and critical, and how we can each leverage our individual networks, our professional networks, and our engagement to ensure that every New Yorker that's able to has a voice in this process, and can see their values and their vision for a future in New York City realized through their empowerment in these elections. And I think, you know, as somebody who's focused on the world of immigration, I think it's really, really important to emphasize how much elections matter. We saw at the federal level just the devastation that 4 years of a Trump presidency brought on immigrant communities across not just our city, but this country. That the nature and tenor and zealous xenophobia and racism that was a part of the Trump administration's and Trump himself's campaign was what was actually realized and actualized through his presidency. And we know how deeply personal and local those policies and politics were, right? When we, that sort of old saying that all politics are local is quite real, and was fully realized in such an intense way for so many folks in our community. And we know that it is really, and we sort of saw this, incumbent on each and every one of us to recognize and be awakened to the fact that we have to play a part in our democracy. We have to see our participation through education, through outreach, engagement, through community contributions and volunteering. There are so many ways to be civically engaged, but also through voting as a key part of how democracy can and should work, and is really one of the many, many, many paths forward to ensuring that all people are treated with dignity, with respect, and with the ability to live full lives. And there's accountability at all levels of government to realizing that. And so a big part of the work of my office, in partnership with so many of our community partners, but also sister agencies, DemocracyNYC and the Civic Engagement Commission being a part of this panel, is to ensure that we're using all levers of our government to empower our communities with education and information about how you vote, where you can vote, what you need to vote, making sure we're advocating to make voting easier. I'm really proud to have launched, through the work of our office, efforts to expand poll site interpretation, recognizing that in a city as diverse as ours, and one in which New Yorkers speak so many different languages, we want people not only to exercise their rights to vote, but to do so meaningfully, to be able to understand the process and their ballot and meaningfully vote. So we've expanded interpretation access, and our partners at the Civic Engagement Commission are leading that programming effort for the upcoming elections. We are also working to create information about the process, about ranked choice voting, about how you can receive an absentee ballot if you need it, about early voting, which was hugely successful last general election, and about your right not only to receive interpretation in some instances, but to take an interpreter in with you. All New Yorkers have that right, regardless of your immigration status, or sorry, immigration status matters. Wrong, I say that so often that it's the thing that naturally comes out, but actually in this context, it matters, so forgive me, but regardless of the language that you speak. So really important for New Yorkers to know that they have those rights. And we've been working for many years to translate voter registration materials into over 10 languages in partnership with the CFB, to build out content to share with folks. And we encourage people to visit voting.nyc. And we will also be updating the city's CEC website and our website with information about poll sites where we'll be providing interpretation services soon.
Well, thank you, Commissioner, and thank you for telling us about all the work that you're doing, especially around empowering New Yorkers to get involved in the civic process. And when I think about empowerment, I think about the not so interim executive director, Lurie, favors, because, when I started the work around the census, the work that you were doing to empower the communities that have been historically disenfranchised around social and racial justice really created a roadmap for the work that we did at ABNY. So if you can just talk a little bit about sort of, why this primary election is so important and the things that you and the Center for Social Law and Social Justice is doing around that.
The not so interim. Let's thank the hiring freezes at CUNY. Hello, everyone. I am so excited to be here with just some amazing women who are just really exemplary models of what it means to do the work and to put the work in action. And of course, our awesome moderator, Melva. I think that's a really good question. What is it about June of 2021 that is so significant? And I think that there are a number of things, in addition to the fact that we now have this much better system of voting. And in New York is certainly not out in front as it pertains to making it easy to vote. But I think what we have seen recently within the past few legislative sessions is that there has been a real intentional effort that the grassroots have been pushing and that elected officials have been responding to, that says we need to make voting and accessing the ballot a simpler, easier process. And I think that all of the disparities that COVID-19 really highlighted for us in so many ways are also reside within the space of accessing the ballot. June is really important because, as you mentioned, Melva, we're going to see record numbers of elections. Just the sheer numbers alone, there are hundreds of people right now who are gearing up for campaigns, who are in the midst of campaigns where they are going to be asking for each of us to consider them in the context of this very new system, ranked choice voting. I will just say, for clarity's sake, the Center for Law and Social Justice at Medgar College, which is a 36-year-old racial justice law center, we have always been advocating these types of voting systems. When I speak with my elders, like our founder, Esmeralda Simmons, she reminds us that we testified as an institution before the Department of Justice to preserve a similar style of voting that was used in school board elections during the 90s and early 2000s. And the reason we did that is because ranked choice voting, these types of systems that allow us to do more than just pick the person, the candidate, allow us to really think differently about how we approach the electoral system generally. When I am doing this work in activism spaces, we often talk about how, particularly for communities of color in general and Black communities in particular, we often vote the way we approach a religious leader. There is often an assumption that the elected official or the candidates know what's best. They come to many of our religious institutions, they kiss our babies, they shake our religious leaders' hands, and we think that that's the person who's going to be able to do the thing that will solve the problems. And that is not our fault that we approach voting that way. We've only had access to the ballot for 57 years. And so communities of color, if you don't have the benefit of whiteness, we're kind of like 347 years short of time to really grapple with these systems and think about how we engage with the ballot much more in a much more sophisticated manner. And so for a lot of us, when we think about the vote, we think about that traditional model. The candidate comes to our civic engagement space or our religious space. They have a great conversation. They're passionate. They give a good speech and tell me, and trust me, guys, a good speech is simply not enough. I cannot tell you how many times I've given a good speech and someone has said, when are you running for office? And I say, takes a bit more than a good speech to be an effective candidate and an elected official. But the reality is we have a lack of sophistication when it comes to these things, just for lack of time and the inability to access these systems with some frequency and regularity. And since we got access to the ballot 57 years ago, it has been while combating some of the most repressive voter suppression efforts. So we're getting access to the ballot. They're trying to take access to the ballot. All of these things are happening at the same time. And so what we have to remember is that ranked choice voting really is going to be more effective for the communities who know how to think about voting differently. And that's another reason why June is so important. I have told people who have said to me, ranked choice voting, I'll think about it later. I don't know why you at CLSJ are doing this whole Rank the Vote BK, which is one of the initiatives that we have launched in collaboration with the Brooklyn NAACP. Why are you having conversations with groups like Brooklyn Movement Center about voting now? The primary is not till June. Why are we even dealing with this today? Well, we're dealing with this today because this system, ranked choice voting, in addition to the minutia and the technical differences that were pointed out already, they require us to vote our values, not our favorite, most charismatic character. That's a difference that I think is going to really show up in this election, because ranked choice voting says, okay, maybe you have a favorite character. Maybe you have a favorite candidate, someone who you're just really, really passionate about. Maybe it's the person you grew up with, or the person who is a real active part of your community. But with ranked choice voting, we have to not just think in terms of the elected officials, but the things we want the elected officials to address. Is gun violence a major issue for you? My house is on a block where we were literally that house, where our block was that block that got in the news a whole lot last summer for violence and shootings that we are experiencing. Is education a major issue for you? Not so much how is your school being integrated, but does your school just have the basic access to resources that you need for your children to be able to succeed? Is food security a problem for your community? Are you one of those communities like mine where you are looking at this corner store, that corner store, the other corner store, trying to decide who got their produce the last so that you avoid that store and have a shot at having fresh fruits and vegetables in your home without having to travel extensive distances? Are you concerned about healthcare? Are you in one of the predominantly Black communities that saw thousands of healthcare beds shut down because of lack of funding for census outreach in years past? These are the questions we have to ask ourselves, because in a ranked choice voting system, voting your favorite character or your favorite candidate is not going to carry the day. Once you've got your favorite person ranked there, then you got to ask yourself, who else is speaking to the issues I care about? Who else is having conversations or has a policy position or is open to my policy proposals on issues that I'm really concerned about? You're simply not going to be able to make an educated, sophisticated election decision if you're doing like many of us do, where you get to the ballot and you're like quickly Googling, hoping and praying that the room you're in has enough signal in the school, because a lot of our schools don't have Wi-Fi. You're hoping you can Google the candidates fast enough so that the line that's growing behind you for the people who did come prepared doesn't get too loud. So when we're talking about ranked choice voting, it really is going to require us to do far more than just have a favorite candidate. This is an opportunity for us to think about our most passionate issues and who is speaking to those issues, not with a great soundbite, but with a phenomenal policy plan, not with a great hashtag, but with a phenomenal approach that is going to allow us to break out of the confines that have sort of kept us locked into these issues in the past. So I think June is a phenomenal opportunity if we approach it the way our ancestors had to approach the science of securing the ballot, which took decades of effort in the first place.
Thank you. And thank you for giving us that clarity around what ranked choice voting can actually do for us, especially when we think about those passionate issues that you talked about, right? And thinking about sort of, passion in unrepresented communities, I have to say that, Women for Afghan Women is an organization when I was working at the Queensborough President's Office that I really respected the work that you guys did, especially when we talk about sort of an underrepresented community and sort of the work that would help uplift and the voice of a group of people, of citizens in this city. So if you could talk about, Roshni, if you could just talk a little bit about, why, from your perspective, why this election in June of 2021 is so important, and the things that Women for Afghan Women are doing to promote the importance of this.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's really an honor to be here with amazing leaders. And I think Lurie did a really great job of basically telling us, why this election is so critical. And I think often we hear, a lot of people may see in the news, okay, there's so much conversation around federal elections. So that's always kind of the central attention. But sometimes we have to kind of convince community members that actually our local elections can be even more impactful in the day-to-day lives of our community members. So issues that they care a lot about, we have to kind of bridge and make those connections, whether it's, religious holidays or like sanctuary city provisions, the push for driver licenses for all immigrants, which I know Moya was a huge part of. And so all of these issues, kind of thinking about the day-to-day lives is so important, especially when it comes to, like we said, a big opportunity to kind of not just think about one individual, but rather so many people who we can kind of go to and say, hey, like, do you have plans? Do you have policies ready to talk about the issues that impact every community and how they are impacted differently. So it's not that we can kind of say this XYZ policy plan is going to work equitably across all communities. No, we have to kind of look at each issue with the gender, racial, class lens. And, I think this initiative will be really important for us to see kind of how prepared candidates are to have conversations. Because before, you can really just advocate for yourself. But now candidates are a little bit forced to look at what are other candidates doing? How can I kind of build connections with them? And in a certain way, I think it will really help kind of foster that more positive environment that we do need to see politically as well. And I think right now what we're really focused on is basically giving opportunities to community members to hear from all these diverse candidates. So actually starting next month, we'll be working with the APA Voice Coalition to have candidate forums for majority Asian immigrant communities, districts with high populations, where they can hear from the candidates to talk about issues that, they're really impacted by and care about, as well as making sure that we have materials and information that is in their languages. Language access is so critical in this process. And just continuing to register more voters and following up and saying, hey, like, do you know that this election is happening? What is your plan? Are you ready? Are you vaccinated? Are you ready to go out and vote? Or do you need to request a ballot? So it's really about getting down to the nitty-gritty details to make sure that they know, okay, can I request an absentee? Like, where do I go? How can I get free transportation? So all of these conversations will be necessary to kind of uplift those numbers that you mentioned with the low voter turnout.
Thank you. And just speaking about sort of the nitty gritty and the information in the chat, if it's not in there yet, we will have a link to the voter resource toolkit and it will also be sent to all attendees at a later date. So just moving on, and we have a little less than a half an hour left, and I want to be able to get to audience questions as well. So if we can limit our answers to about 2 minutes, that would be great. But as we think about New York City's recovery and government's role in shaping an equitable, inclusive future, right? We keep hearing equitable and inclusive, right? Those words. I'd like to talk a little bit more about the role of women, right? We are a women panel here. And while there are more women running for office, there's a lot of concern about women still being underrepresented. And this question, again, is for everyone. Do you have any ideas about how we can change this trajectory? And more importantly, what do the 2021 elections mean for women, women's representation in our local government specifically? So I'll start with Lurie.
I think that's a really important question. I'm setting my timer so I stay under my limits. You know how I can get. I think it's an important question. And one of the things that we have to remember about women voters, especially when we're talking about women voters coming from the communities of African descent, is that when we vote, we do often what Black men did when they first got the right to vote after the passage of the 15th Amendment. We vote in concert with community. So one thing I know as a surety, my friends are going to hit me up a few weeks before election day. All right, Lurie, who are we voting for? And we're going to have this conversation. I don't tell them, guys, but we're going to have this conversation about who we're voting for. And then we're going to talk about how the person we think might be our candidates of choice, how they speak to the issues that the various portions of the community that we represent. So when I'm voting, I'm not just voting for myself. I'm thinking about my husband, who I'm also having these conversations with. I'm thinking about my sister friends. I'm thinking about women who have family structures that are different than mine. I'm thinking about the families that have two moms as the head of household. I'm thinking about families that have a single parent as the head of household. I'm thinking about parents who live in schools where, yeah, there's this raging conversation about school desegregation, but that's not a concern that we actually have. We're thinking about other issues related to school equity. So when women are voting, we are carrying those issues into the ballot booths with us. And particularly Black women, we are voting with sorors. We are voting with God sisters. We are voting as community, and we're approaching it from a not how do I benefit, how do we benefit? And focusing on that approach, I think asking women to run for office is one of the main ways that we can target the numbers of women who don't necessarily run for office, but could. One of the things that I learned from following Higher Heights is that most women are never asked to either vote or to run. And I think having forums like this where we are asking women, particularly women who are master organizers in non-traditional ways, to throw their hats in the ring is a vitally important part of disrupting the idea that women can lead, but typically from the back. When we ask women, and then when we ask them and we make room for them to vote, not just for them, but for their whole community, that's going to help target those women who are traditionally excluded.
Commissioner Mostofi, over to you.
Yeah, I think it's like really important to note that we have a city council right now where I think just under 10% of our representation is women. And women actually in our city make up over 50% of New Yorkers. And so much of what lies ahead in terms of our thinking about the direction our city should take, I think every day as a woman leader who is a mom, as a boss of many incredible women who are also mothers or caring for their family members, the droves of women who have left the workforce and how challenging that has been during this pandemic. And the reason that happens is so much because of the structural and systemic ways that both work is looked at, and the fact that women are often tolling multiple jobs, right? Like not the invisible work of home, but the real work of home. And that got further brought to the forefront during this pandemic. And part of the reason we are here is because we haven't had enough women at the table. So it is really, really important, and I think extra emphasized for us this voting cycle, to recognize that we need women to run. We need women to be at those tables, to be driving leadership, to be able to further their representation and meaningful representation of our experiences, of our needs, of the systems that are not responsive to ensuring that we can actually both lead and contribute, as well as play the roles that we need to in our homes and families. So much has to shift for that to happen. And as we know, that only happens when we step up to lead and make it happen.
Yeah, and thank you for both of you sort of encouraging people to run for elected office, for women to run for elected office. And as we've seen in recent years, that there has been a number of organizations with their primary mission is to get more women in the local races. And I think you absolutely right. It's all about the lens in which you do your work and their perspective, and encouraging women to run for elected office is one way to do that. And over to Roshni, if you could also address this question, but also have a specific question for you, because I'm really curious to hear about what you are hearing from women in your work about elections, and why are these conversations about voting so important? Like, what are you sort of hearing in your network?
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, I actually was going to bring up the fact that I really appreciate there are so many groups and organizations kind of seeking to provide more access through resources and guidance and mentorship necessary to run for office. And that's been really incredible to see, because I think a lot of the time, women might even come up with the idea, but just feel like they don't have that support network or the resources or the knowledge necessary to kind of navigate what it looks like to run as a candidate. So I think it's so incredibly important to not only push people to run, but to say, hey, these are the people that, will support you and will stand by you through this process. And it's really also incredible to see specific city council members who are women kind of leading the way and pushing for this and providing their guidance. And I think that's so incredible, but it also, makes me wonder that how come the responsibility is kind of also falling on the women who are already doing that work? We need to see like other men in the city council and in higher positions of power to say, hey, we're going to work hard to uplift other groups and underrepresented communities. So that onus shouldn't be on the people who are already struggling with the access. So I think that's really important as well. And in terms of, conversations we're kind of hearing, whether it be, really with community members, a lot of the programming we do, as you know, is like kind of always looking at all of our work through a gender equity and violence prevention and intervention perspective. So it's not only looking about issues that are specific to women, but making sure that all issues, whether it's about COVID recovery, healthcare, education, is always examined with all of the different lens. And in particular, we're working with so many organizations that are feeling like right now our community members are really just trying to get by. They're concerned about how to pay rent, how to make sure that they can access, the vaccine. So we really have to work extra hard this time around to kind of connect the issues. And one great model that I know so many organizations already do is like tying in the ongoing direct service programming classes into civic engagement. So when, for example, when we have community members calling about vaccine, we also have a column, in our spreadsheet to say, hey, are you registered to vote? Are you eligible? Because we know that right now it's going to be really difficult to just talk about voting on its own, but rather we need to connect all of the issues that they're concerned about. If we can tell them, hey, you're really concerned about this issue, we have this big race, and this is going to decide so many important decisions about housing and social service funding. How about you take a chance and, take a look at these candidates? We need to kind of make sure that people know that these upcoming elections are really going to impact the day-to-day, because otherwise, it's going to be really difficult to kind of push people to look beyond just tomorrow.
Yeah, thank you for that. And, when we talk about barriers, and, this question is for all the panelists, but, I specifically want to hear from Lurie and the commissioner on this, and Lurie touched on this earlier, what are some of the barriers to voting from a historical context, right? Really interested in how, communities of African descent, Lurie sort of told us about, we've only had the opportunity to vote for 57 years. And, for the commissioner, right, what's the city doing so that immigrants can feel their right to vote is supported, and sort of the historical context behind that. But really would love to hear, I guess the audience didn't know you were going to get a real education from a historical, like this is like school. We're taking it back. But from a historical context, some of the barriers that certain populations in historically disenfranchised communities have had to face around voting. So I'll start with you, Commissioner.
So, really critically and importantly, something that I think not everybody recognizes or knows is that you don't have the right to vote unless you're a US citizen. And you have the ability and you must pay taxes if you're working here, and you have to give into the system in all of its ways, right? But you don't have the right to exercise voting and participate fully in the democracy unless you're a citizen. And the reason that that's particularly critical in New York City is so many of our residents are what's called legal permanent residents, or folks who are one sort of pathway away from becoming a citizen in the longer spectrum of their immigration journey, but who have been legal permanent residents for decades. And we, in fact, estimate in our office that there are about 600,000 or so legal permanent residents in our city that are probably eligible to become citizens, and thus eligible to vote and realize their full rights under US law, and haven't done so. And there are so many barriers to that that we know exist. There are barriers to legal access. There are barriers to language. There are barriers to just the system and understanding the system. And those are sort of some of the main ones, and there are even more. And we have done various efforts to expand access to citizenship, legal services, to expand access to education and know your rights courses around civic, the exam that you have to take, and the literacy, adult literacy support for folks going through the process. There's financial barriers for folks who can't afford to go through the process. And so we have tried to address some of those as well. We've partnered with our DemocracyNYC initiative in the past, actually, once somebody goes through the citizenship process, ensuring that somebody's on the other end to register them to vote, because that doesn't happen automatically either. And that's not something that the federal government has guaranteed as a part of that full process. So there's lots and lots of barriers. And a big one is just moving people who are legal permanent residents in our city to going through that process of becoming citizens and fully being able to exercise their right to vote. And that's a big one and has been a focus for us. Additionally, as I noted at the top, providing interpretation services has been really important and a priority for our administration over the last few years, is expanding the languages that are provided at polling locations. And that's something that our Civic Engagement Commission will be doing this summer in the primary and also in the general election. So we look forward to working with community members on that. And as I noted, also rights education. You have the right to take an interpreter in with you, and making sure that folks know that they can do those things to fully exercise their rights to vote.
Yeah, that's important. And thank you for that. And, you know, a lot of times people miss the intersection of being an immigrant and being Black. I'll pass it over to you, Lurie, if you could just, again, talk a little bit about the barriers and the work that you've experienced around voter rights.
Absolutely. Half of my family is in that scenario that the commissioner just described, where, you know, they've got the permanent legal status, and it's like just that one more thing. Some of whom realize now that it is a really important one more thing. And a lot of the methods that the commissioner just outlined for the supports that you can use during voting, having someone who can serve as an interpreter for you, all of the advances that we've seen in voter protections, all of that has been fought for because of the way access to the ballot was so racially restricted from the outset. And so, Melva, when you talk about that history, that 347 years, where there was a time in this country, the vast majority of time that this country has been around, there has been an intentional restriction of the access as to who could have the ballot. And the reason for that is because the framers of the Constitution decided that political power, resources, and access to resources in this country were going to be shared, distributed, and transferred based on the results of elections. So when we saw on January 6th that all of those folks who rushed down to the Capitol, who were very, very angry about what was happening, they weren't angry, as I've often said, they weren't angry about Georgia voters. They were angry about Black Atlanta voters. They weren't angry about Pennsylvania voters. They were angry about the Black voters in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. It wasn't the Michigan voters that made them so upset. It was the Black folks in Detroit. Shout out to my sister's hometown. And so when we're thinking about what was happening on January 6th, that very violent moment, it was really one of many attempted insurrections at stopping the peaceful transfer of power, whenever that transfer of power was based on votes that Black and non-white people had cast. We know that in the days following the Civil War, after we got the right to vote and then we ended slavery, and then it was brought back again through the criminal justice system. We get the right to vote through the 15th Amendment, and then it was eradicated because states' rights and the Klan became very active. And they literally went up into state houses where Black people had been elected into office, and they violently removed them. They cast them out. And we have one history book that says, as a result of the violence at suppressing the results of Black voters, the floors of state houses across the country were left, quote, slick with the blood of the Black people who had been elected, the Black people who dared to cast a ballot, and they were violently opposed with white nationalist repression of the vote. So having access to this ballot, it's not just about the voter registration, which is what we got access through with that 1965 Voter Registration Act. It's also, how do you create committees Who serves on a committee? What role does seniority play? When we're talking about fundraising, who has the right to raise the funds? Who has the right to access the funds and to transfer the funds from one campaign to another? How do we get an issue on the ballot? Yes, maybe we want to have a person on the ballot, a candidate, but what about the issues we care about? What's a referenda? How does it work? What do you need to get it there? All of the intricate details and the very boring sort of eye glazing over approaches to democracy and civic engagement are the result of rules that were created while those of us who were a part of the African-American tradition, we had to sneak out into the woods to teach our children how to read, while our white brothers and sisters, the people who literally owned our bodies, were in well-lit rooms where they were deciding how to create towns and to funnel money towards the town. So all of the intricacies that go into maintaining the body politic, all of the intricacies that go into not just do we have a school, but who gets to run the school? Who do we listen to when we're talking about what is taught in the school? Are we the white parents in the South who decided we don't want our children taught about evolution? We prefer the creationism reality. And are we so organized and mobilized within our town that we can demand that that's what's taught? All of these decisions are based on sophisticated engagement with the body politic, with the rules and the norms. So when you are excluded from that for 347 out of the 402 years that you have been a part of this country, when you only get access to that in 1965, and we've been fighting and holding on and clawing our way to maintain our right to vote ever since, and when we've got January 6th of this year, where white nationalists who, with the support of people inside the building, let us be clear, are able to not just show up at a rally, they can afford the buses, the planes, the flags, the paraphernalia, break into a building fully gas masked and armed with weapons to stop the peaceful transfer of power because Black folks dared to vote, because the AAPI community dared to flex its muscles and say, you know what, we've got the range, we can get in the booth, because the Latino community was like, what you're not going to do is exclude us and not even give us a proper racial category. When all of those groups come together and say, yeah, we're not here for it, and we're going to put an end to this white supremacist leadership structure that you currently have in play, when we see that reaction, what we realize is that history is today. Past is present. And if you employ a West African Sankofa approach to understanding the history and the current, then you realize that we have just as much work to do, if not frankly more, than did our ancestors when it comes to preserving our right to the ballot, which really is about preserving our ability to have equitable access to resources, power, and the benefits thereof.
Thank you for summing that up, that historical context in today's relevancy. It's and illustrate how it's all connected. There were a bunch of finger snaps and preach in the chat. It's always a pleasure. Roshni, I didn't know if you had anything to add about sort of the barriers that New Yorkers, women are facing around voting.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely, really want to emphasize that it is important too when we do talk about, registering new voters or outreach to immigrant communities, that we also kind of do give credence to, our the communities that have been here, who have actually fought, for our right to vote. So it really is a privilege that we can kind of, we come here and we're able to vote now, and that's been through a lot of hard work that we kind of need to continue to push for. And like Lurie put really beautifully, when we all kind of come together and collectively fight to reduce these barriers, I think that can make a lot of really great things happen.
Yeah, thank you. So we have about 7 minutes left, and I do want to get to some audience questions. Then I have a final question for all of you. This is a question from the chat. How do we aggregate women's voices to impact elections? We talked a lot about sort of the organizations that have popped up to encourage women to get into elections, but how do we bring women's voices together and to support women's needs directly? And if anyone wants to jump in and answer that, how do we aggregate women's voices in elections?
I think, one part of it is really the resource component. So many of the candidates that are there now are because they're being provided with the resources and support. So I think, even just being able to highlight what are the different campaigns and organizations that are funneling that direct support and resources to women, that's so critical, because, without that, they cannot keep continuing their campaigns and fundraising. And, it's not even about necessarily donating money if that's not accessible to you. It's really about giving your time, making those phone banking calls, and I've seen a lot of different women candidates kind of supporting each other, and I think as much as we can create these spaces like we're having right now, conversations around what to do to keep kind of pushing the needle, and looking at what are the different organizations that are doing this work and finding ways to kind of plug into them, rather than sometimes even at this moment like recreating a whole new wheel. I think there are so many great people doing this and being able to kind of bridge connections. So I think just people need to reach out, plug in, share whatever resource is available to you.
Did anyone else want to address that question? We can.
I mean, I would add by just saying, and this kind of takes us back to what this upcoming election presents by way of the ranked choice voting and sort of how to approach this process is, you and your group of women, right, or your community of women, and Lurie talked about hers, right, like that you're gonna come together as a community and you're gonna have these conversations, and you and the women in your life are gonna exercise their rights as a pack in some instances, or at least through a process together. And I think that is critically important. So recognizing that you have the ability through your networks and through your own families, friends, professional colleagues to have this discourse. I don't know, maybe there's a particular issue that you care about. Reach out to the campaign, right? Invite candidate to answer questions or to tell you where they stand on an issue that's particularly important to you. Make sure you see reflected in their policies the responses or the values that you care most deeply about, and that you push them, if they're not there, to be responsive to those things, because it's through that accountability and back and forth with candidates and through demonstrating that you're engaged, right? And that these are the things that you care about, and that you are actually coming at it with a community, that you can see your values reflected back at you through the ballot, right? And that can help. That ranked choice voting gives you an opportunity to sort of engage the various candidates, whether it's your council district or at the mayoral level, on the issues that you care about and value. And to do that in concert with your community and through the women that are a part of it is really powerful.
Yeah, and in talking about ranked choice voting, there's another question that came up in the chat. And the question is, ranked choice voting is a big change in New York City voting, as we know. What other changes have been made to voting in New York City in recent years, right? So we know that the primaries were pushed up. We know that how people vote in terms of the machines, right? Electronic voting has changed. Early voting, right? All of these things. What are some of the other ways that you're seeing the changes are affecting the way people can actually vote, the way candidates can campaign because of COVID-19, right? There's a lot of changes in recent years. So I don't know if anyone wants to jump in. Lurie, Bitta.
Yeah, I was just going to say, in addition to everything that you mentioned, I think the COVID-19 factor has really made things very interesting. There was really a lot of concern that a number of potential candidates had about how are we going to have this new system, and how am I going to communicate with people when we're on the lockdown? And it caused a lot of consternation. I think what you're seeing in response to that, and in response to just the COVID reality, is that people are Zooming their lives away, in good and bad ways. But we are making better use, I think, of electronic outreach and electronic media. People are having to be way more creative. I know that there were a number of elected officials who were saying, man, how am I going to also, get my senior citizens on a bus and get them to get their vaccines and talk about ranked choice voting? And we said, well, talk to them on the bus, right? So while they're on that bus going to get, or if they're going to get free meals and you're wondering, how am I going to educate the community? Well, every single touch point that we have been able to have, and this is what we had to do with census, because Melva, you know, we had an amazing census campaign. I mean, all of you who are part of the census team, I love you guys to this day. But then COVID happened and we were in the middle of a pandemic, and it was like, well, I can't go to the Black-owned hair salons and daycare centers because they're all behind, they're closed down. So we had to just really be that much more creative. And I think, you know, going to food distribution centers, going to places where people are now gathering during the pandemic has been one of the things that people have had to adjust to, matching mutual aid with civic engagement. Hey, do you like the idea that we were able to have a pop-up food distribution center? That's because we made sure this community was properly represented on the census. What does census have to do with food distribution? Let me tell you, here's an insert that I'm going to put in your bag of food. Let's talk about it. So having to be way more creative in our terms of education and grassroots organizing is something that's definitely changed. And even when we go back, I'm kind of hoping that that continues.
And before I bring Carol on to wrap us up, I'd like to do a lightning round because we're at 2 o'clock. Just a lightning round, one question, if all of you can respond. You know, we sort of talked about the changes in voting, and we know what's happening across the country in terms of changing voting laws, and preserving and expanding voter rights are so very important, right? We know that. So can each of you discuss one initiative or piece of legislation that you would recommend that will aim to increase voting rights in New York in ways that people can support? Roshni, you want to start? Sorry.
Yeah, sure. So, you know, one legislation that I recently heard about, which I think is incredibly important, you know, there are a lot of formerly incarcerated New Yorkers who don't have access to the ballot. Apparently right now there are 43,000 New Yorkers who are not able to access the ballot. And though in 2018, you know, Governor Cuomo did sign an executive order to restore the right to vote for people on parole, but this was through using his pardon power. So to ensure that people can automatically be registered to vote once they complete their prison term, we have legislation. I'll put the number in the chat and details, but I think this is so important because when we talk about you know, voting access for all, we cannot leave behind those who have intentionally been disenfranchised by the system. And so, you know, I think there are a few more pieces of legislation, but this is really one that I think is incredibly important to continue bringing up and emphasize that this cannot be, you know, a one-off opportunity, but rather this should be something that New York continues to set the precedent for, even when the rest of the country is kind of pushing back.
Thank you, that's great. And just a disclaimer, we are a nonpartisan discussion panel here today. We're not endorsing or we're not promoting one side over another. Commissioner?
Sure. You know, there's a lot of different efforts. There's efforts at the federal level to protect voting rights and to build on prior legislation during the civil rights movement around voting access, and to ensure that, as we've seen in some parts of the country recently, that really arbitrary and racist attempts to create barriers to voting are struck down or not allowed to continue. And that's hugely important. When we talk about sort of what we're seeking to realize, I echo what Roshni said. It seems preposterous that we would strip individuals who have been incarcerated from their ability to exercise their rights to vote. It doesn't make any sense, and no sensible or human rights-centered society should take that approach. And there have been interesting, you know, we've seen realized automatic voter registration in New York State as one of the recent things that are good. There's also discourse and discussions about expanding the right to vote beyond citizens in local elections. And that's something that has been tried in very minor or narrow ways in some parts of the country through school board elections, but an area that I think is particularly interesting and important for us to continue a discourse around.
Thank you. And there are tons of resources in the chat, and I'd like to close this with Lurie. How can we support to preserve or expand voting rights?
We need a New York State Voting Rights Act. So in addition to restoring the vote, and I'm so glad you said that, Roshni, because that you took my one of my top ones. I'm so glad you were able to speak to that. But we need a New York State Voting Rights Act with a pre-clearance provision so that we are put back into a place where in the absence of a federal Voting Rights Act, which was eviscerated by the Supreme Court in Shelby County v. Holder back in 2013, we need a state version of the Voting Rights Act to ensure that not only do we have uninterrupted access to the ballot, but that we have equity as it pertains to those parts of our state which still exist that have been very intentional about repressing the right to vote from a number of people who don't fit the traditional voter model. So I think in addition to restoring the right to vote for formerly incarcerated persons, as the Center for Law and Social Justice, we would also say that people who are incarcerated should be allowed to vote. That I know that is just our particular vantage point, but I will just offer that as well. I think we can do more in that regard, but we need a New York State Voting Rights Act in addition to passing at the federal level the For the People Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act.
Thank you. This has been a phenomenal discussion, and the panelists, you women rock. We can probably go on for another hour. I just want to remind everyone that the voter toolkit is in the chat, the New York City voting toolkit. So please download it. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for joining us today, and I'd like to turn it over to Carol Wasey to close us out.
Hey, Melva. Wow, you said this panel rocks. You rock too. This was really amazing. And on behalf of the partners, that's DemocracyNYC, as well as the Civic Engagement Commission, we really want to thank you, Melva, for leading us through a very complex and really important discussion around voting in New York. And to our panelists, wow, each of you have so much to bring. You're providing such important leadership across the city and quite frankly for the country. Just hearing your voices gives me hope that we can actually do something here. And we got to make sure other people hear these voices every day. Because Roshni, Lurie, Commissioner Mostofi, you really are setting a very high bar. While you've all acknowledged we've made a lot of progress, I think, Lurie, you said, we're almost in the worst position right now. There's so much that's needed, and there's so many challenges that are going on, and we see them every day in the news. And I think just how all of you positioned, really looking at the candidates in a different way. Lurie, I like what you said around seeing them as characters is not so helpful. We really need to get to the heart of what they stand for and really challenge them. And accountability was a theme today, which is really exciting and really important. And getting back to that theme of why we're all here today, we know politics are local. Many of us have worked on a lot of different levels in terms of government and politics. It was great to see Leroy joining us earlier today. I've worked with him for 20 years. It's nice that he's interested in what we're doing. We got to make sure everybody's interested in what we're doing and make sure we're on that road to making some significant changes. So the question I want to leave everybody with is, where do we go from here, right? There's a lot of work to do. We have important elections. You all have highlighted so many of those reasons the elections are so important this year. I think one thing, that we've mentioned that toolkit, the deadlines are really key. We want to make sure all the people that we want engaged know about the deadlines, that they're very in tune with everything that's coming up, both for the June primary, as well as looking ahead to the general election in November. We talked about some of those key things that are happening, ranked choice voting, and Lurie, you did a great job at the beginning of this, setting the stage for that. We didn't talk much about our city, our vote, but we think that's incredibly important too, to make sure all of our great immigrant neighbors have the right to vote. So we're going to be working on that as well. There's some opportunities there. And we also want to remind everyone, as you're talking to people about the elections, think about a plan. I know I don't get things done without having a plan to do them in my personal or professional life. And voting is no different. And it's so important, not only to each of us personally, but to our community, to the city, to the state, and to our country. And again, it's an area where, while New York has made a lot of progress, we have an incredibly long way to go. And I think it's great to see all of you really pushing the envelope and pushing us forward on that agenda. So I just really, again, want to thank all of you for such a great conversation, our partners, and all the people who joined us today for this really important conversation. A lot more to come. Stay tuned for upcoming events from all of us. I know we're all going to be really engaged in the coming months, and wishing you all a great afternoon. And thanks for joining us.